Hey guys, Nikki here. My husband and I just went through IVF and we are one of the lucky couples that actually had insurance that covered it. Now, I know that may not be the norm for everyone, but I do think it's important to understand how IVF insurance works if you are someone that may be looking at IVF in the future. That way, if you stumble upon a job that offers it, you understand how it might work. Let's get started. So first of all, major shout out to any employer that actually offers IVF insurance because it really isn't the norm. From some research I did, it looks like 40% of companies offer some sort of fertility benefits. That doesn't mean that IVF is necessarily fully covered, but at least you get something. That is up from about 25 to 30% last year. So we are seeing it trend upward. The reality is that fertility treatments are very expensive, and that's why not every company is willing to invest in them. For the purposes of this video, I'm really only going to talk about my insurance company. My insurance is through Progyny, which seems to be a well-known provider in the field. My clinic that I worked with was very familiar with Progyny. They have a lot of customers that use their benefits. And also the pharmacy that I used for my medication had a dedicated phone line for Progyny customers. So I do think that they are a huge provider, but they're not the only provider out there. Also, before I started using my benefits with them, I did a call with my patient care advocate who explained everything to me. And that's where I got a lot of the information for this video. It seems like IVF costs can vary widely, but I'm going to base my numbers on what that patient care advocate told me. So the research that Progyny has done says that the average full round of IVF, from the point where you're meeting with them for the first time all the way to a first transfer of a viable embryo, costs $27,000. And that assumes that your first round of IVF yields an embryo that is viable. That $27,000 includes the initial evaluation, all of your medications for the egg retrieval process. For me, that included 3 different medications that I was taking on a regular basis throughout a 2-week period, as well as the trigger shot medication and an antibiotic for the egg retrieval process. That also includes all of your appointments leading up to your egg retrieval, where they're monitoring things with blood work and ultrasounds to make sure things are growing the way that they should. The egg retrieval itself, which is a procedure that they will put you under anesthesia for, so you're actually out of commission for a day or so. The 2 types of testing that you can do after, which is PGTA and PGTM testing. PGTA testing screens for chromosomal abnormalities that will often result in miscarriages. So if you're trying to prevent the possibility of a miscarriage, you can screen out some of those embryos there. With PGTM testing, they're screening for genes that will cause a particular disease. Not everyone needs this, but we're trying to avoid a gene that causes muscular dystrophy. So PGTM is critical for us, and actually the reason why we're doing IVF in the first place. If you want some more information about how I found out I was a carrier for muscular dystrophy and also why we're doing IVF, I'm gonna link a video in the top right corner here that walks through that whole story. It also includes the medications for the embryo transfer, as well as the transfer procedure itself, which is less invasive than the egg retrieval procedure. Now, I know that was a long list. To give you an idea too, that of that $27,000, about $9,000 of that is the medications. Also, if you're going through IVF right now or have gotten a quote for it, I'd love to know in the comments what that total cost is for you out of pocket if you're not using insurance. I'm curious how much that cost varies from provider to provider in different people's experiences. Now let's talk about how fertility coverage actually works. But I just want to touch on the fact that not all companies provide traditional insurance. Some will just give you a blanket amount of money that you can put towards fertility related treatment. So I have a friend that works at a very large, very well-known tech company who just gives her $75,000 that she can use towards things like egg freezing or IVF or IUI, which seems like a great way to do it. It gives you more flexibility. As I'm gonna walk through in a second, Progyny has a very specific way that you have to go about it in terms of choosing what things you're going to use your coverage for at a point in time. So getting into my Progyny benefits specifically, I don't have experience with using them for things like IUI or surrogacy. I do know that they cover that, but I just know the details for the actual IVF side. That was the only option that we personally considered because we're trying to avoid the muscular dystrophy gene. So Progyny breaks up their coverage into these things called smart cycles. The way my care advocate explained them to me is that each smart cycle is like a pie, and you can spend pieces of that pie in order to get different services. For IVF specifically, a round of IVF, which is the point of consultation all the way through getting like an egg retrieval, fertilizing those eggs, getting the PGTA or PGTM testing done until you have viable embryos. Although obviously having embryos at the end is never guaranteed with IVF. But that is a round of IVF, and that costs 3/4 of a smart cycle, or 3 pieces of pie. You can also use 1/4 of a smart cycle or 1 piece of pie on an embryo transfer. Now, to give you an idea of what those are worth monetarily, so we talked about how like a full round all the way through a transfer is $27,000. If you break that down a little further, $22,000 is a round of IVF, and that $5,000 that's left over is the transfer cost. And that's important because, again, you can spend your benefits with those pieces of pie in whatever structure you want. But for me, I wanted to minimize the overall cost because I only have 2 smart cycles as a lifetime benefit with my coverage. So I want to obviously spend the least out of pocket as possible by maximizing the amount that Progyny is going to cover. So in terms of cost efficiency, if it turns out that in my IVF journey, I need 2 rounds of IVF, it's better for me to spend my smart cycles with 2 rounds of IVF and 2 transfers, regardless of how many transfers it eventually takes for me to have the number of kids that I want. That's because for that IVF round, it's costing 3/4 of a smart cycle, but it's worth $22,000. Versus using 3/4 of a smart cycle for 3 embryo transfers, that's worth $15,000. So obviously if I'm gonna do that second round of IVF, it's gonna save me $7,000 by using it towards the IVF round instead. Now it's all a little bit of a gamble because you could get a bunch of viable embryos from your first round of IVF and none of the transfers work out, and then you need to do that second round of IVF. We're in a bit of a unique position because the muscular dystrophy gene is passed on the X chromosome. So my kids have a 50-50 shot at being carriers. Now, while it likely doesn't affect girls if they're a carrier, it can affect them. If I have a boy and they're a carrier, they have the disease. And I just don't want to take the chance of passing along that gene to my kids if I can avoid it. So we're choosing not to use any embryos that are carriers of the gene regardless of the sex of the embryo. But what this means is when we ship embryos off for testing, typically you lose 50% of your embryos to that PGTA testing that screens for chromosomal abnormalities. I'm likely going to lose another 50% to that PGTM testing to screen out the muscular dystrophy. So if you think about it, like if I'm lucky enough to ship off 8 embryos for testing, PGTA testing is probably going to take me down to 4 viable embryos, and then the muscular dystrophy testing is going to take me down to 2. So I'm not going to end up with a ton of embryos in all likelihood. So I'm pretty confident that I'm going to need 2 rounds of IVF. In fact, we ended up doing 2 rounds of IVF back to back in this process because of that. We want to try to make sure we have all of the embryos we need as early as possible for all of the future kids that we want to have. That's because our doctor told us that for every live birth you want to have, it's helpful to have 2 to 3 embryos. The rate of success if you have 3 transfers is 95%. So it really protects our ability to have the number of kids that we want. Okay, so now that we've talked through a little bit about my unique situation as well as, how the benefits are structured, I want to talk about how it works in terms of payment. So I'm sure the natural question is IVF truly like 100% covered? And the answer is no. It really depends on your specific insurance because Progyny is a secondary insurance that stacks on top of your regular insurance. So again, here I'm going to give details about my insurance policy, but you're going to have to kind of translate it to your own base insurance in order to understand what it might cost for you. So we have a medium deductible health insurance plan that has an overall out-of-pocket max for the family, but also an out-of-pocket max per individual. The only numbers that really matter here are my personal out-of-pocket max and my personal deductible because all of these services are happening to me only. So my individual out-of-pocket max is $3,500 and my individual deductible is $1,000. If you're not familiar with those health insurance terms, your deductible is the amount of money that you are responsible for before your health insurance starts to pay for things. Your out-of-pocket max is the maximum amount of money that you're responsible for, after which your insurance would cover 100% of the cost. Now, in between those two numbers is where things get kind of interesting depending on your personal coverage. For my insurance, after I hit my $1,000 deductible, my insurance covers 80% of the cost. I cover 20% of the cost until I hit that $3,500 out-of-pocket number, and then they cover the rest. Now, earlier in the video, I gave some quotes around the cost of an IVF cycle, right? So to give you that frame of reference again, if a full round all the way through a transfer is $27,000, my personal cost by stacking my regular insurance with Progyny would be at most $3,500. It could be actually less than that. So if I've spent $1,000 on healthcare before I started that round of IVF during that calendar year, then I would actually only be paying $2,500 for IVF because, again, that money all contributed to my out-of-pocket max. So it's pretty cool. It really makes it a lot more affordable. Now, the other thing to consider here, which is why we actually did a second round of IVF this year, is that, again, like, you're hitting an out-of-pocket max for the year. So let's say I do 2 full rounds of IVF and only 1 transfer. That is $49,000 worth of benefits, which, again, well over the out-of-pocket max that I'm gonna hit. That entire second round of IVF is covered at no cost to me. Doing 2 rounds of IVF back-to-back would not be the right approach for everyone, but in my specific situation, because we have the ability to minimize the cost here, and also knowing that the number of embryos that are gonna be viable for me gets so low because of the muscular dystrophy gene, banking them up front is really helpful. And then because they have to be frozen anyway to do that PGTA and PGTM testing, we're just gonna be able to keep them frozen until we wanna use them. I think the cost per year is $750, which is not cheap, but it is in the realm of affordability for us. So we're definitely planning to do that for as long as we need. Now, at the point of filming this video, I've actually completed 2 rounds of IVF. I do plan to do a dedicated video on each of those rounds. I wanna talk about not just the experience of IVF, but also how it differed because of Progyny. There's some additional logistics stress that you get from using Progyny, and I'll get into that in those videos. It's well worth it though, considering the financial stress that it takes away. When those videos are totally ready, I will add them to the description box of this video, and I'll also link them on the end screen here. I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if this video was helpful to you, and I will see you next time.